I don't know where the thermostat is. Dave is looking for it now. Do any of you know how to control anything in this monster? It goes along with the reading. What the reading does being much too low. So if I want to read anything, I have to get way down here. That's okay. Great art always creates enormous inconveniences. So yeah, doesn't worry about it. Or as George Howe used to say, George Howe was the famous man who built the Philadelphia Savings Fund Society, and he grew up in Boston, and he was a Boston Brahmin the same year at Harvard as Franklin Roosevelt. And when he was a little boy, his grandmother took him to the Boston Symphony, and he got sick. He just desperately ill. And she took him out and she cleaned him up and she said, "George, you must learn that everything worthwhile in life takes place in nauseating surroundings." Right? Now, these aren't exactly nauseating, but they have some problems. Dave, did you find anything?
No, I can go to the office and ask.
Better. I'm so sorry. We'll see if we can work it out. Anyway, we'll make do for the time being with what we have. Now, you remember last time I talked about English architecture in the 19th century. And Dave, can you close that door? Can you close that door? Thanks. Thank you. And remember, it really starts with Pugin. And it starts with Pugin's vision of social justice, which, however, founds in the end the British Socialist Party, the British Fabian Socialist Party, which is a very conservative party, and which, like so many things English, looks back to the past, to tradition, to lead itself forward in progressive action. So Pugin looks back to the Middle Ages, and he sees the Middle Ages as a time when the environment was possible to live in. And he sees the 19th century up above as one where the environment has been so polluted visually and in every other way that it no longer supports a decent kind of life. And of course, basically, he was right about the way cities were developing. And we saw that out of that comes that whole development of English vernacular architecture in the 19th century, which culminates with the Garden City movement, which now has been revived by the new urbanism and so on, as you all know very well. And I do think that that period just before the war, that period of British culture as it matures about 1912 and 13, just before 1914, is maybe the most civilized period in the history of Western civilization. It created some of the most civilized artists, like E.M. Foster, for example. Wonderful, gentle, perceptive vision of a kind of civilized humanity. And at the same time then, it culminates in that terrible war, which ends it all, which ends Fabian socialism, which ends all that wonderful mixture of respect for the past and belief in the future, and which again, though, gets a magnificent expression about what war really is. It's horror, it's terror, it's pain, it's emptiness in a great English architect, in Sir Edmund Lutyens, in the great monument at Thiepval to the dead of the Somme on the right. Now, in this whole period, as you'll remember, when we come to the climax of it, even to the war, the vernacular and classic traditions of architecture, which Creer, who designs this building, called them, the vernacular and classic traditions of architecture are still going strong. They're basically what the English have. We saw how the English held on to their vernacular, Voysey and Lutyens and the others, right up through 1914. And Lutyens there is one of the great expressions of classical architecture, as we see it. Now, what I want to talk about today is in large part the beginning of that movement, which calls all this tradition into question, which calls the whole tradition of the vernacular and classical traditions of Western architecture into questions. And again, I think it's fair to say that the most important part of that movement starts in England. So again, I go back to England, and I want to talk about it from that point of view. Now, what I'll be talking about to start with is the so-called English aesthetic movement, the British aesthetic movement. And it is aesthetic. It's one in which the past is seen as something that needs to be changed visually, in which all of a sudden you can't bear the way things have always been. You want to simplify them, you want to clarify them, you want to abstract them, and we'll see how that occurs. And I think if we look at it very simply, we can see it this way. If you take the Red House by Philip Webb for William Morris in 1859 on the left, Then you take a pre-Raphaelite painting, so-called, by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, wonderful name, 1874, called A Roman Widow. You see that they have a lot in common. And what they have in common is a very traditional sense of form as plastic, traditional Western sense of form as plastic, three-dimensional, modeled in light and shade, dark, solid, all that. You feel that very strongly. At the same time, both of them are growing out of that early English Gothic revival, Pugin, Ruskin, all the others. So there's a profoundly aesthetic sense operating here, but it's still a very traditional one. Now, if we jump from there to the 90s, this is what we get. If we start with Rossetti on the right, there's a fully modeled three-dimensional figure in chiaroscuro, right? All of a sudden, we have Aubrey Beardsley in the Yellow Book in 1893. You see what's happened. It's gone flat, it's abstracted, it's clarified, and two fundamental things have happened. Things have been simplified. All the richness of detail, all the furniture, all that, all the modeling of the face and the body is gone in favor of a very clear, flat pattern. Now, it's clear that there's strong influence from the Japanese print here, as we've already seen coming along through all this period from the 1870s onward. But also there's this basic fundamental urge to clarify, to simplify, to flatten, and to bring it down into black and white, as it were. Now, if you take on the left the house here in 59 and look at Broadley's on Lake Windermere by Voisey, that we've already talked about, see the way he renders it in 1898, look, exactly the same thing has happened. It's turned black and white. It turned to basically a flat pattern, abstracted here into black and white. Now, the way that happens, the way that develops, begins to move out into other things too, but I'd like to develop that. This is really the heart and soul of the English aesthetic movement as you find it matured by the 1890s. Now, architecturally, we might go to Bedford Park, and we go to Richard Norman Shaw, remember, with Hope Dean Surrey. He is attacked by Gothic revivalists for his aestheticism. That's to say, remember they say he'll put tile hangings over perfectly good brick walls, and he'll be eclectic. He'll use Queen Anne or Georgian detail and basically classic masses. All of that, though, is very elegant part of this whole development. Then by 1885 at Bedford Park, you see Voisey now is taking the same step that you see in Aubrey Beardsley on the right. He's flattened it, he's clarified it, he's simplified it, abstracted it. It's a clear, sharp volume. It's called the Gray House. It's not as white as it looks here, or it wasn't as white originally, but it was still a very light color. And it had that pattern of window placement of black against white, exactly as in the figure on the right, with a dark roof against the white again. You see how it's exactly like really this rendering. Where is it now? It's really like the rendering by Voisey, more than Broadley's itself. That house by Voisey really itself is. This is in a way, even though it's 1885, the realization in architecture of that thinness, that abstraction, that elegance, that aesthetic delicacy which you have here. Now, it's interesting that maybe the most talented practitioner of this kind of architecture in England was a Scotsman, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And the paradox is that he comes from one of the toughest countries, one of the toughest cities in the world. Glasgow is famous for its famous Gorbals slum, with its constant racial strife. Of course, Ireland is just across the way. All kinds of Irish workers are there. There's all kinds of tension. It's a really very tough town. It's famous for being an extraordinarily hard town to get along in. But Mackintosh's architecture, like this in his own flat, has a totally different feel. It's like the feel of the Aubrey Beardsley on the right. And indeed, the lighting fixtures up there look much the same. Again, it's very light. It's flooded with light, flooded with windows. Very delicate details. Very, what the 19th century would have called very feminine furniture, very elegant, very delicate. And it's wonderful, though, you notice that he uses exactly the same elements that Frank Lloyd Wright uses at the same time. And they both derive from the Japanese, but they go in absolutely different directions. That is, you remember the Japanese kamoi and the rama, which gives you the strip under the ceiling, which sets the scale. And right, you see, in the Ward Willis house on the right, he brings it way down. It's very dark. It's very heavy. The furniture is what the 19th century would have called masculine, mission furniture, heavy, designed in the same scale as the house. Completely the opposite. Wright is making this cavern. He's making this, we talked about it before, this image of a childhood state in which you are protected in the deep shadows of the house, but the space opens freely, so you're also liberated by it. All of that. Mackintosh is just the opposite. The scale is totally different. It's very high. It's very light. Same elements, totally different intention. You can see. Or if you take this Aubrey Beardsley at the same time, and you see the image of an ideal drawing room, say, by Beardsley. It's like a set for Lady it's like a set for Lady Windermere's fan. I was going to say Lady Chatterley's lover. That's another question. But Lady Windermere's fan by Oscar Wilde. It's delicate. It's very feminine, and it's again, you see, it's the same elements as that rail going along there, just above head height, but it's totally opposite from the right. It's a completely different world. It's the world that the modern architects later would recognize in terms of its light and its simplification and its clarification, but they came to hate that wonderfully decorative, light, feminine quality that moves all through it. And you see it would fit right perfectly with this little fireplace in Charles Rennie Mackintosh's apartment, which is it's in Glasgow, both these views, this one, the living room, that one of the little study on the right of 1900. And you can see how exactly they go precisely together. Now, it's interesting the way Mackintosh works. On the one hand, he is from Glasgow. So when he builds the Glasgow School of Art in 1896, 1897, and then adds onto it right about 1900, you see that here's a great big tough building. It's totally the opposite of these interiors, which he's doing at exactly the same time. It has even a brutal contrast between a medieval set of forms which is made very heavy, very looming, very ominous, in sharp contrast. You couldn't get a stronger contrast with the enormous industrial panes of glass. Enormous, the kinds of things that are going to have an enormous influence on Corbusier a few years later, where you see they go up several floors in height. They're protected against vibration by iron supports, sort of buttresses that come up at the side. So you have a very strong industrial image, which also involves a contrast, a really brutal, strong, strident contrast between heavy masonry masses, castle-like in profile, and then this factory-like sash in front of it. And inside, on the interiors, you get much the same kind of thing. You get a staircase like this, which is really raw, consciously intended to be. Straight, sort of awkward structure, masonry, untreated, concrete, iron. The whole thing is tough as can be. One thing that's happening to it in the final edition, which you see on the right, on the right-hand slide, is that all of that is beginning to move in his final work about 1900 toward a kind of flow, as if all that masonry is beginning to melt. You can see it here. It's not very pronounced, but it's right there. It comes down to the entrance like this. It begins to flow, and it flows out to that little railing like that. Now, where that comes from, you can go this way. Here's the same time, 1900. And here is Mackintosh working for his wife. And his wife runs a number of tea rooms in Glasgow called Cranston Tea Rooms. And he designs a number of them. And this one especially is the most famous of all, of 1896, 97, 98, in that era. You can see, you could put it right alongside a print by Voisey. They both have that flatness and that elegance. They both play off that dark plane, very sharp edge dark plane, against the light that's contrast with it. They play that delicate pattern that you get in the wallpaper as you get there in the windows. You get what you don't see very clearly here. There's a very delicate, subtle bay on one half. On the other hand, you get no ornament. You get absolutely sharp-cut window planes. And when you look at it, and even when you look at the detailing of the fenestration, especially in the upper floors, you can't help but think that Irving Gill in San Diego must have seen this when he did his Wilson Acton Hotel in La Jolla in 1906. You can see it's the same. You've got the same detailing in the windows and so on. You get that sharp, that complete lack of ornament. He, of course, is using concrete, so it really is a materialistic expression of the structure. Macintoshes, of course, is stucco over any kind of structure behind it. But again, it really goes right on to Loos. Remember Loos in 1910 in the Steiner House in Vienna? You see, you really have almost, again, the same mullioning, the same handling of the windows as sharp-cut voids in the clearly rendered plane, the flat roof, all those things connected. Now, remember, Loos is the man who wrote that ornament is crime, Ornament und Verbrechen, in 1905. And it's really almost the opening gun of what was to become the international style aesthetic, which hated ornament, hated it. You remember what Loos said? He said, only primitive people or sexual perverts, I mean, that's the word, that's the phrases he used, will use it. Now, this is interesting because inside those tea rooms, especially inside the one you just saw, there's one of the most elaborate systems of ornament here at architectural scale that the 19th century was to produce. And out of it was to come that movement that's called Art Nouveau. And you see what you have here. You have something there. Those are pre-Raphaelite women, like the first one you saw, but abstracted like the Beardsley here. And Beardsley, by this time, by 1893, is doing illustrations like this for Oscar Wilde's play, Salome. Now, the name Oscar Wilde suggests another important fact here, that the British public as a whole began to associate this movement, this aesthetic movement, especially as it climaxes in the 1890s, with gay culture. Now, they didn't call it gay culture. They called it things like the sin that has no name and stuff like that, and romanticized the whole thing and so on. But it was a culture that was really very strong in England, especially in the universities. And it had all kinds of roots. It had respect for the Greeks and a Greek tendency toward homosexual relationships. It had the whole English public school business where boys were separated from girls in all their formative years. It's very strong intellectually, but it's against the law. It's absolutely underground. Now here it kind of begins to surface. It surfaces in Aubrey Beardsley. It surfaces in Oscar Wilde in a kind of heroic, really kind of brave resurgence of this illegal state of mind, being, reality that could send him to prison. And remember, Oscar Wilde was shortly after Salome. Salome was a play he wrote, which they didn't allow to be produced in England, but which was published and which was illustrated here by Aubrey Beardsley. And you know, it's about the Salome of the Bible, who dances for the head of John the Baptist, for her mother, really, who wants it. And she confers with her mother there on the right, the two evil women here. And then when his head is cut off in the play, she takes it up and kisses it. You see it's happening there. And the blood is coming down in this wonderfully decorative stream going down here into the water. And then Herod has her crushed by the shields of his soldiers and says something like, lie there. And so Oscar Wilde writes this, and it's played in Paris, a great success. It won't play it in England. Shortly afterward, of course, there is the vicious trial in which he's pilloried, and the whole aesthetic movement is pilloried here, and is closely connected with the rise of a gay culture. Now, you know, Mouchon in the New York Times, who's my idea normally of a terrible critic, nevertheless, he wrote a very interesting and very honest article a couple of months ago. He's gay, and he talked about how, in fact, he felt that the whole revolutionary culture of New York had been made by gays, by gay culture. He wanted to change the world, actually. He wanted to change those laws that repressed him, society that said it was the sin that there was no name. And And something of that sort was happening here. Wilde was really trying to do that. And you've got to remember how effective Wilde was in this. When he toured the States, and he had this wonderful costume, like a Lord Fauntleroy. And he would carry a lily. And he would go into an audience like this only of miners. He'd go to the miners in Colorado. They thought he was wonderful. And he admired their costumes, so their red shirts and their Levi pants or whatever they wore. And it was all aesthetic. And the sense of this Art Nouveau line, you see, it's like Aubrey Beardsley, it's like a line that's in water. It's all flowing. It's all fluid. It has no body. And this one, it's kind of a languid line. I mean, it's like a water lily. You get a feeling, a little like the lilies Oscar Wilde used to carry. You get a feeling that it couldn't stay up except in water. It's all a complete denial of all that toughness, that hardness. All of those things have played such an important part. All that preoccupation with masculinity, they play such a part in 20th century culture. Well, those are deep waters and difficult for somebody like me who's no expert to go into, but it's important here. And you should bear it in mind because you see, when you get something like this, and then just a few years later, you get Lowes saying ornament is only done by perverts. It's clear, I think, that some of that otherwise inconceivable, still inconceivable passion of the international style architects against ornament, that hatred of ornament, you really do feel, I think, and it probably is working as a kind of homophobia working through that, kind of fear, kind of anguish, kind of anger. And I think it certainly is there in Lowes. Certainly there, we'll see later, in a lot of German art. Now, in any event, you get the most beautiful architectural expression of all this, not in England, but in Belgium, of all places, in Brussels, in the hands of one very remarkable architect named Victor Horta, H-O-R-T-A. And you say, why Brussels? Well, Brussels, strange place, all these avenues upon which his houses are to be found are called Avenue Palmerston, Avenue Gladstone, Avenue Metternich, and all the great statesmen of the 19th century. And Brussels was building itself up in the 1890s as a kind of wonderful, opulent capital. And the reason for that, largely, unfortunately, is about the most evil story that Western civilization has to produce. And that is the fact that the Congo in Africa, enormous area, was taken over as his private property, not belonging to Belgium, by King Leopold of the Belgians in 1884. He took it over, and then he exploited it savagely. He exploited it for slaves and for ivory, and later for rubber. And out of it came the most terrible atrocities that the West has ever committed. For example, his soldiers, his askaris, had to account for every round of ammunition that they expended. So they would fire them off. They usually miss. But they had to show something for each round. So they would round up children and cut off their hands and bring the hand as an image that they'd kill somebody with the round. Now, the curious thing is, in World War I, when the Germans invaded Belgium, where they behaved very badly and they shot burgomeisters and everything like that, nevertheless, they did not do what the Allies claimed they did, what the Belgians claimed they did. They did not cut the hands off babies. They didn't do it. But his Belgian administration had done it in the Congo, in fact, just a few years before. It's a really horrible story, but it's a true one. Now, on the other hand, poor Horta has nothing to do with that. And as a matter of fact, as we'll see in a moment, he doesn't like it. But he is wonderful at picking up that wonderful languid linear motion as of underwater in these wonderful little interiors that he does. And this is one where it's an entryway to a house, and you see the beloved material of Art Nouveau, because it's so ductile and it can be so delicate, is iron and glass. You can see it there, and it's really almost as if he's making that skirt. He's making that flow. He's making an underwater structure. You see this one, which is one of his most famous ones. These are all in the 90s, so you don't have to worry about the dates. So they're all 1890, the climax of the century. You see this one where you have a little central kind of atrium, a kind of hall in the house. And you have a metal structure which is continuous between the column and the supported arch. They really flow one to the other. And then you have very delicate scale. It's very small. It's very private. Again, you think of the aesthetic movement as being private, as being that of persons who are not concerned with the public world and public face, but with private experience. And then it's also water. I mean, those images look like things in water, they look like water plants over there, which are moving. And you see, again, they seem to grow directly out of the same impulse that makes the Beardsley. Now, it's fascinating. It should be iron and glass because, as you know, later the international style historians and so on will fix on the Crystal Palace as the great achievement in iron and glass in the 19th century. And of course it was a great scale. It was an industrial scale. It was an industrial component. You can see them up there on the roof, which were reproduced in series, mass production, reproduction, and so on. It all was a new industrialized process. But this is handicraft. This is iron and glass coming out at the end of the century in this wonderful personal handicraft, small scale. And early, people like Gideon and so on, they hated the Art Nouveau. They all just loathed for a long, long time. This was the most, again, they would call it perverse, perverted, effeminate, as you like. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. Now, the other thing is, it also, in a curious way, goes back to the beginning. Remember, we saw modern architecture really starts, say with Jefferson, with the classical revival in the 18th century. And they revived classicism. The Baroque has ended. They react against the Rococo. On the right is a beautiful Rococo interior of the 1730s by an architect named Buffon in Paris, the Hôtel de Soubise. Now look how much Art Nouveau is like it. They're both private, they're both small scale, they're very elegant, they're very decorative, both go continually from the wall to the ceiling. Over there, the intersection is sort of thorny, as if you're in thickets. Here it's turned to water, become more fluid, but it's the same kind of thing. There you have all the mirrors, there you have the little mystery about where you are. You have much the same kind of effect on the left. It's as if all of a sudden, after everything that's gone through, and then right to the very end, they've gone through the classical and then the Gothic revival. They come back to before modern architecture. They come back to where things had been before. And in a curious way, in French culture, upper class French culture in the 18th century, a much less oppressive civilization than, say, the Victorian one generally was. And the other thing is this: it's right in these years that they're beginning to dig up Knossos. Sir Arthur Evans is digging up the great Minoan capital of Knossos on Crete. And they bring up jars like the one on the right. And we have all water imagery. And we have especially the octopus, which they love. And born by water, you have that wonderful curvilinear movement that's like Beardsley. It's like this. Look at the lighting fixtures over here compared to the octopus over there. Now, I don't know whether there's any contact between these people, if they know about it. They've even seen it, but it's a curious thing that's going on at the same time. Same sensitivity. It's all for flow, all for continuity. You might say, too, that it culminates a century that worried about the development of forms over time beyond creation, beyond the old Bible view of creationism, but into the whole evolutionary movement. This is, everything is moving, everything is in flux, everything changes, everything is impermanent. Now, as I say, it is on the whole, primarily, though not exclusively, an interior style. And when you come to the exterior, this is another house by Horta. It's the Tassel House, about 1896. You can see that it's not much different than the traditional houses on both sides. It's a little more fluid, the one in the middle, but it respects the others. It's not a new urbanistic idea. It's not a new overall domestic idea that breaks with the streetscape or anything like that. It's basically still within a basic urbanistic pattern. On the other hand, the house is expressing the wonderful staircase. You can see it here. If you go in the middle, like this, you come up, half up, come up. You see where it opens out, comes up the top where it's flat, goes back to the top. Up there are skylights which are lighting down through this stair which is moving up through it. And it's really a curious thing. I mean, if you have here this post right here, I believe it to be, or one of these things right here. This one, I guess, right there, whatever. And then the plan isn't quite right. I've never been able to make them come. But you can see what basically is. You can see how there you have a typical Art Nouveau capital, which again is like an octopus shape. And its backgrounds too in French Gothic revival, especially in the work of Viollet-le-Duc. I think you can see, I mean, you take Viollet-le-Duc working in iron, as I talked about before, working with the colonnette en délit, with these dry pieces put together. And then he has an open work truss. Then he wants to show how you can stiffen it in a very decorative way with animal forms, with vegetable forms, like this. Well, it's as if there the vegetable takes over the whole thing. And all of this gets obscured in a continuity, which then carries on at the wall, as you can see as it goes up the stair. You can just imagine it's carrying you up the stair, almost as if you're carried up backwards on water. And when you get, and again you see how you feel, how Minoan it is, how like the octopus form it is, how fluid it is. And when you get to the very top, under the skylights, where are you? You don't know where you are. You have mirrors on both sides. You have the light coming down from above. You have all these tiny forms merging into each other. You hardly know which is up or down. And again, this is this building right there in the late 90s. It's exactly while Freud is writing his interpretation of dreams. You really feel you're in a kind of dream situation. Most of all, like Freud, you're dealing with a very personal. It's a very personal effect. It's a very human effect, and a very confused one. Where am I? Who am I? What are the oceanic forces that move me? Am I drowning in this? What's reality? All those things are there. Now, having said all that, I have to show a wonderful contradiction to it. It's a private style and all that, but its most important building is a public building. And again, as in England, as with Pugin, it's a public building which is socialist in its program. It's called the Maison du Peuple, the House of the People, and it's really the headquarters for all the unions, the Social Democratic Party and the unions in Brussels, where there was a considerable amount of social unrest at this time in 1900. One aspect of that social unrest had to do with the disgust on the part of a lot of people for the policy that was going on in Belgium. Now, it wasn't being done by Belgium. It was being done by the king. But Belgium had profited, as you can see, in those rich houses by Horta. And in 1907, the Congo was ceded to Belgium. Belgium, as a nation, took it over and tried to clean up the worst of the abuses. But then Conrad writes about it in Heart of Darkness, as you remember, where Kurtz looks into his body and says the horror, how the horror of the barbarity that the West had brought intends in the end, all of it dying off in barbarity and blood and darkness. In any event, and like Pugin, Horta and the Social Democrats hate classical architecture. And the way they have a good reason to. They associate it with Leopold, they associate it with the law and with power and with the state, and they're in reaction against that. And there is one building there in Brussels, on the highest point in Brussels, which would arouse anybody's, it seems to me. And this is the Palais de Justice, the big hall of justice, the place where people are tried. Now, it's classical architecture, you see, at a terrifying scale. You can see the size of human beings there. You can see the size, the way it piles up in these masses like this. And that central pavilion there goes up into dark shadows, looming, threatening. It's terrifying. You really feel it has its power brutalized here. Now, we've seen that classical architecture can do anything. It can do this, and it can do Lutyens, and it can do anything, but this is one thing it could do, and it's one reason that the international style architects later, most of whom were very leftist in political organizations, hated classicism. And to this very day, I was on the jury when Tom Beebe's building one in Chicago in 1988, and those architects like Jan and something said, you don't want classical architecture. That's the architecture of repression. That's the architecture of brutality. Well, of course, it's not. It's whatever, classical architecture is whatever you want to do with it. But what they wanted to do with it here was one thing it could do, since it has a great political past itself, is to express enormous power, authority, And this is in reaction. Now, therefore, like Pugin, but for different reasons, he hates it, and he wants to turn to the medieval past, and he does. And for a model, and this one is by an architect named Poelart, P-O-E-L-A-R-T, Poelart, starts in the 1866, and you can imagine it's not really finished until about 1900. They're working on this great pile all the time. And this is in constant reaction against it. You see how small scale it is, how gentle each element is. Almost all of that is iron and glass, just as delicate as you can get, and soft curves, tracing its little square down there in the heart of Brussels. And what they look toward is the late medieval municipal architecture, the late Gothic municipal architecture of Brussels. And this is one of the main squares in Brussels of the late Middle Ages. And you can see it's small scale, delicate window pattern, the whole thing is linear, very light, especially this one, which was called the Maison du Roi, the House of the King, and which was in restoration exactly the same time this building on the left was being built, 1896, 1897. That was restored by 1897 on the right. You see how similar they are. They both are very light bays, defined by very delicate columnar structure. Here it turns to iron, but over there too with that ogive that moves between the columns, you see you get some of that flow that you get here. So this is the model, the medieval model, exactly like Pugin, and with the same political intention as that Pugin had. Now, it should be contrasted there on that little place with Sullivan at the same time, who in his iron especially, as we saw before, has a lot of elements that are like Art Nouveau. He derives them from the Celtic manuscripts, as we saw, but it's the same fluid pattern, interweaving, and so on. But look at the way he used it. He used it to enhance the really automobile-like velocity of the street, and it bursts out at the corner, and it turns the corner like someone shifting gears. Here, it's a footpace. You can see how that is a pedestrian architecture. See how small it is, too. You see the scale there of the steps. And when you get to the corner, instead of bursting out like Sullivan, it looks backward. Or, sorry, it's really charming. It looks backward like this. And that whole exterior is shaped the way it is to simply to shape the urban space. The basic big room behind it is just a great big rectangle. Now that's a very important room, though. That was the place where the Social Democrats of Belgium met. It's their headquarters for the whole town. So you must call it social meeting, and at this time, socialists have, in Brussels at least, certainly not a violent intention, but a revolutionary intention. So, and the room is wonderful for that. If you see on the right, where you stand, if you're lecturing, you're looking like this, the whole thing keeps coming down at you like that, as if it's really full of energy. It's ready to act, it's ready to march, it's ready to go. And you feel it, especially these balconies that come for you like this. And they're part of a wonderful structure, which is very Art Nouveau in the sense that it's completely continuous. You see you have that open truss, and it's carrying all the forces out on a diagonal, and it's helped in bringing it down to the vertical by hanging most of this off this point. So you can really feel how just where you want it, it's being pulled down to the ground like this against the outward forces that are going like this. The whole thing is flowing like this, and then even the chair tops, it's like the sea coming at you. And one is reminded of a painting by Van Gogh, say, of a little earlier, of the 1880s, where, again, Starry Night, he calls it, where you feel maybe what the socialists intended. Not only that big evolutionary continuity that runs through nature that the 19th century began to believe in, but also the tearing up of the old world, which is picked up by this new energy, which you have here. Now, this room was almost the place for the most significant meeting that the Socialist Party ever had in the early 20th century, but it wasn't. And it goes like this. In 1902, the Russian Social Democrats, led by Lenin, all of whom were in exile, they asked the Belgians if they could meet here. They could have their big Social Democratic Socialist Party meeting here. The Belgians said, all right, fine, come. They came, and the Belgians, being basically socialists maybe, but good bourgeois, thought these Russians were dirty, were scruffy, were dangerous, were raggedy. They didn't want them. They wouldn't let them use this room. They made them meet in a sort of shed out in back. And the socialists got angry, and they went to London. they had the meeting in London. And at that meeting was the one where Lenin, unfortunately, Lenin leading the majority, that is the Bolsheviks, threw the Mensheviks out of the party. In other words, there was no more give and take, there was no more discussion. It was just a brutal rule of the majority, the Bolsheviks. So that's when the Socialist Party under Lenin, in that particular case, becomes the Communist Party, basically, and finally leads that what turns out in the end to be that tragic revolution in Russia, right? And which turns out to have destroyed socialism. I mean, socialism is almost destroyed throughout the world now because of the confrontations that were set up by that violence. The only thing that's won in the 21st century is consumerism has won over everything practically. But whatever the case, this was almost the center of that. It would have been appropriate too. It would have been a beautiful place for it, but they didn't let them have it there. Now, we see that as a social program, very closely associated with Pugin, the Middle Ages. But then if we go to Barcelona, in an architect who was contemporary with Art Nouveau and does much the same things, but has a power that none of the other architects have, Antoni Gaudi, get a totally different kind of man, a very conservative man, a deeply, profoundly Catholic in a very traditional sense, but mystical, very special view of what the church should be. And he's the one who builds, of course, those great buildings in Barcelona, in Catalan Barcelona, of which the best known is the Casa Mila of 1906 and 1907. And you can see, I'm going to come back to this later, but you can see, just superficially looked at, it's almost as if he's illustrating, he's working with the Van Gogh. It's all the power that works through nature. Everything is moving, everything is changing, everything is fluid, and everything is turning into something else before your eyes, with then strange Freudian images of dream on the roof, which we'll talk about later. Now, Gaudi, along with everything else, in a sense that really connects with all this view of evolution and so on that we've talked about, said that one should build according to nature. Build like nature, he said. That was his intention. And if you look at the plan of the Casa Mila, it is as if you had a wonderful sort of stress-skinned plant, like a cactus, like a great cactus, hollow in the center, stiffened by the continuity of that fabric around the center. And if you go into one of those courtyards there, you can see that the big columns of what look like bamboo or something of that sort. They look like very much like a tropical plant of some sort. Now then, when you go to his masterpiece, never finished, not finished yet, the Church of the Sagrada Familia, the Church of the Holy Family, which he starts working on in 1884 in Barcelona, you see one of his models, one of his many study models of what the nave is going to be like. And I might say the scale is supposed to be enormous. A human being really would be right about down in like this here. And it can be seen, I had a colleague named George Hersey at Yale who was intrigued by these intersections, the way he handles that bony structure that he imagines. And he found almost all these shapes in a book that was owned by Gaudi's brother, who was a doctor. And they're all there, they're bones, connections, they are organic. Now, it's interesting that Frank Lloyd Wright, a little later, is going to talk about organic architecture, by which he really means intrinsic, I think. Intrinsic to itself, organic in itself as one structure, but not like nature. His buildings don't look like nature at all. Here he really is organic in that sense. He wants it to be like nature. And if you look at it here, well, you can see this building that I want to talk about a little bit now is one that has never been finished. And it's always been a great ruin. We've all known it as a great ruin. And he died I think, hit by a streetcar of all things in 1927. And work stops for a long time. They work on it from 84 to 27. And then they pick up work again. And they work on it a little bit all the time. Now they're working like mad, which is the last I heard, to try to finish it. I don't know whether it's a good idea or not. I think they're using precast concrete where he would have used carved stone, many instances. Whether it's a good idea or not, whether it isn't better as a ruin. Because, of course, one of the great facts of the 20th century is that it made more ruins, probably, than any other century ever did before. The ruin is deeply built into the culture of the modern age. First, the romance of the ruin, then the terror of the ruin, the sorrow of the ruin, the drama of the ruin. And this, as a ruin, as a never-to-be-finished ruin, always had to me an enormous appeal. Whatever the case, this is the way it's looked most of the time. Now, the way he conceives of that hall is a kind of thing we already saw in Maybeck at the same time, just even a little later in Maybeck, where you start with a Gothic revival image, like this, say, like a drawing like this one, something like one's by Viollet-le-Duc. If you look at this drawing where Viollet-le-Duc claims that all the shapes of Gothic architecture derive from structure, and that structure has a logic of moving all the thrust of the vault out on a diagonal until the buttresses can bring them down enough to the ground, building out to the side. If that is so, then everything below here is counter to that whole system. These verticals here are really counter to what's going on up there. So remember what Maybeck did, he just took them out in that Phoebe Hearst Hall. You have the diagonals going right down to the ground. Now, this is basically what he does here. He doesn't take the columns out, but that big bony structure comes down in a conical shape, which has a continuous cone as it comes down. There's a human being. He's very carefully considered in size. The capitals, enormous. And imagine sitting up in this tribune, terrifying, way up there in space. But you see it has a conical projection. Now then he projects for it, and this is one of many models, a conical massing, where it starts way up the top with this, like the monstrance, like the great golden monstrance in which the host is held up in the mass, comes down from that. They're all with crowned with something of that sort. Some of them had eyes in them and so on. And it comes down into a conical thing which comes down and then flows, as it were flowing, as if it were a kind of mushroom, as if it were organic growth down into the ground. Now, on the other hand, that massing is really very Gothic. It's what most Gothic cathedrals wanted to be and never really got to be. For example, here, Reims, the massing of Reims, as they intended to do it. You had central tower over the crossing. You had towers around it, like that. You had two towers at the gate, you had two more towers in each transept, so you got almost as many towers. But what he does is take it, and there's no straight vertical, you see. It comes down like this. Then you'll say, well, on the other hand, this is all crystalline here, and that is fluid. And as the very earliest photographs anybody ever saw, when I first started teaching in the late 40s, these are the only photographs we had. We didn't know a thing about Gaudi. Not a thing about him by that time, in the States, at that time, with our background and what we'd read. But here you see the whole thing. It's as if the stone is melting. It's all fluid. Whereas you look at a Gothic structure, say look at Reims or Amiens or something, this is Reims again, you see it's crystalline and fixed and finished and geometric and so on. However, what you're looking here is at Reims after the German bombardment in World War I. In the middle of World War I, the Germans bombarded Reims, and it's an interesting propaganda thing because the French had always associated, curiously enough, Gothic architecture with the Germans, something barbaric. Germans were Goths. The French were classic. That's why the people who taught me, like the great Henri Faucillon of the École des Chartes in Paris, always talked about notre Moyen Age, our Middle Ages. They wanted to reclaim the Middle Ages. Then when the Germans bombarded Reims, the French grasped the Middle Ages. They clutched at this. Yes, you see this German barbarity destroying our great medieval monument. When they did it, the church burned. The church has lead roofs. In the burning, the lead melted. The melt came down and eroded the stone, melted the stone, and it got to be like what Gaudi had already imagined. It becomes a ruin, becomes a burned ruin. Look at this one. So that the Christ and the Virgin here in one of these things where it's all beginning to drool, you see, all in ruin, is like Gaudi's great thing here of the Virgin child here in this flow. So he makes the great, and this is one of the early photographs too, he makes the great ruin. It's really why, in a way, I hate to see it finished, especially in precast concrete, but we'll see. Now, the other things about it too that have to do with the idea of the ruin is also the idea of nature, because any of you who have been to the Southwest and see the great saguaro forest near Phoenix and so on, know that when a saguaro dies, that's what it looks like. That's the inner structure of a saguaro when all the flesh has dried off it, when it's all gone. It looks like a dry, dead, great stump of some plant. And he sees it, too, as something that's also not only natural, but also exotic. And Spain is trying to get a foothold in Morocco at this time. And for Morocco, he designs this, I think it's a Franciscan monastery. And he imitates the sort of dovecote towers that you get on the mud structure, the terrapize structure of Islamic mosques in West Africa and in Morocco and so on. At the same time that they're like dovecotes, at the same time they're like the saguaro. And this is Gaudi projecting that. At the same time, of course, he's working on the Sagrada Familia. Now, what the building was going to be like, one really can't say. He had every kind of project. And those projects were wild and mystical and on some strange mystical scheme that only he himself understood, like this. And all of them, I know some of these were going to have eyes, and there were things hung between them. And he kept doing these misty masses it was going to be, and one can't tell. One can't tell. And the way you see it, mostly, are these great dead saguaro holding up the mass, holding up the monstrance, like that, holding up the gold, holding up the host and the gold. And down below, like the interior of a cavern, hollowed out. Like the caverns of the prehistoric paintings in them that were being discovered not so far north, at Chauvet and places like that, in the south of France, not far from Perpignan, not far from the Catalan territory. Now, that sense of related to Catalonia and to the deep past and to the primitive beginnings of architecture is very strong in him. He has a patron named Güell, G-U-E-L-L. And Güell is a very rich family, a Catalan family in Barcelona. And he does a colonia for them, a colony, and where there's a church. It's basically a funerary church. And you can see what he does. He makes it look just as primitive as possible. He has that same diagonal continuity, and he makes the caps look like the first rough-hewn caps ever cut by Neanderthal man. Now, at that very same time, and in this state, in ruin, and then studied and reconstructed by friends of Gaudi, like the great Catalan archaeologist Puig Cadafalch here, you have a church which is the beginning of Romanesque architecture, the very beginning, called Saint-Martin du Canigou. Canigou is a mountain right on the border between France and Spain, and it's Catalonia, because Catalans go both sides, as you know, of the border. And you just wonder when you get this great, rough rubble wall, so thick, and then it's supported on tiny columns like this, monoliths, of which you get a great cap which brings the square in plan down to the circle in plan. Like this, you get the mass of that. And when that's covered up, it's really like a cavern. See? As if he's picking that up. See that drama? He picks it up here in a more primitive way. But the same thing, and all the beginning of Gothic Romanesque monumental sculpture takes place here, where they try to express the forces that move down through it, you see, from the square to the circle. Stylistique monumentale that the French and Catalan architects write about. And now again, too, he does a park for Güell up on the hill in the first height of Barcelona, which looks back down across the rest of the city. And again, of course, you can be reminded of Maybeck, though Maybeck is working just a little bit later. Here's Maybeck in Berkeley, the Goslinski house, where he clearly makes eyes, little witch's house, funny nose, sniffling like this. And here you have the same kind of thing, Bates Snaggletooth, witch's house, nasty little eyes, menacing gesture. And it's the gingerbread, too, it looks like. And it's the entrance to the park, which is right on the height, overlooks most of the city down below. And indeed, the way you see it is really much better. You see it in, sorry, I don't know what happened to it. I wonder what I did with it. I have it out of order. I want to say that you see it through trees, so it's really more mysterious than that other view. And you see where you go by, you see the scale of it here, one of the entrances. Then the main entrance is this one, and it looks back down across the city, and right in front of it, high up on the height, there's a little primary school. And if you go there in the afternoon, you find the women in their little Seats and so on, picking up the kids. Or sometimes the kids flooding across here. These are older, down into this place and going up that wonderful Baroque stairway, which you see in the center. Now that stairway is the real masterpiece of this first thing. You see what he's got on it. As you go up that stair, you come across this ancient animal, like some prehistoric animal, and you get this wonderful Catalan tile that he uses to give you the sense of this chameleon-like play of barbaric colors across it. Then behind it, you see, you have what looks like Doric architecture. You have great big Doric columns and caps and a big entablature. But what is Doric architecture but a fixed point load? And not space, but body. So close, it's not space. They're bodies, like your body here. And this is Hera, heavy, menacing, looming on the landscape. Look what he does with it. Oh, what's going on here? It's like Gothic architecture that's been hit by an earthquake, and it's flowing back and forth like this. That's the last thing it will ever do. And then at the same time, it's making spaces back in there. First of all, it's melting. You see the sharp details up there, the guttae and so on, under the triglyphs. Then they melt this. And then the whole thing is moving and it's making a space. And these are so much like persons that when they do that, it's as if a monster is making it. It's Doric architecture absolutely misread, perfectly perverted into this great cavernous place, which makes this underground hall. This great hypostyle hall where you get these beautiful flat Catalan vaults and sea creatures and octopi up there like this. These great big flat caps. Look how he makes it pressure as it comes down. And then as you go in this way to the left, it gets more and more primitive. No more Doric, prehistoric cavern architecture. Goddess of the earth appears out of the rock. You've all read Tolkien, Shelob's lair, the spider armored deep in this cavern like this, that arachnid-like gate like that, and all the stalactites coming down like this from this. Really, really marvelous, strange evocation of primitive, cavernous experience. Now on the right, if you go to the right, that leads you up. You see the stair. It leads you up to what those columns are holding up, which is really the climax of the park, which is a great, big, sandy, open space, where you have this wonderful seat. It looks across the city this way, and the seat is all one great serpent. You're there in the folds of the great serpent, again with that wonderful Catalan mosaic. Now, these are amazing because they never come off. But you get somebody like Bofill, who to my mind for a while was a very interesting architect before he lost his nerve. And he uses this tile, but he can't stay on. It comes off. Everybody tries to do modern tile like this. It seems to pop off the building all the time. Somehow Gaudi's, they were able to make it. And you get this great serpent. Just going then to the right of it, across it, you look up to the full height, right behind the thing. And it's as if you've gone back to the Jurassic period. As if the thing is turning into Carboniferous, turning into coal or something up there. And that leads you to the higher hills and the coastal range beyond. But the other way looks back over the city. And Barcelona, is really one of the most amazing towns on the Mediterranean. It's Carthaginian, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But down there, there's a sailor's Barcelona right down in the flat. And that's like Glasgow. That may be the toughest town in the world. And there's where you get the great medieval buildings and the medieval cathedral. Then you come to a central area, which is really like a French town. Big boulevards and streets and so on. And there you get where Gaudi's working in that middle area. But you also get houses by Gaudi down on those very civil, very French streets. You get one like this, for example, where at the street level, it's opening up and flooding, opening up like some fluid material that's pressuring up. And as it goes up, it presents as balconies, it presents skulls like this. And then at the very top, it's like a great lizard hump back like this. And then you get another one, which all of a sudden erupts between the other houses like this. Still keeps, though, I mean, it's not a new urbanism. It's obeying the laws of the street and all that, but it's just different things. It's a lot like Frank Furness, really. Remember some of his things in Philadelphia in the middle of the 19th century. But the Casa Mila really takes up a lot of space. And it really is the one that is the most urban. It's on the most important boulevard. And the Catalans, the Barcelona people call it the stone quarry. It shapes that whole corner like shaping a whole block. And again, it doesn't outrage the urbanism, but it brings this primitive force within it. And it really is all representational. If you come down into Barcelona, as you tend to do, from the north, say you come down from Perpignan along the coast, through Port Bou and all those wonderful places, you go through an area that isn't so different. You get water-washed high bluffs like this. And you get the way you do in Maine, you get seaweed, as it were, very, very high up. You can't imagine the tides could ever have been so high. It's as if you're under a place which really is tidal, however high it goes, which starts down below as if it starts in fire. Then it grows up out of it. Now you can imagine when we first saw these photographs in 1947 or 8 or 9 or something like that, we were positive this had to be concrete. But it's not. As you can see, it's all cut stone. All a stereotomy of cut stone. But it's very important for what happens in some concrete construction later. It's a suggestion for the continuities that can run through concrete. But he's wanting to do something else. He's showing you this coast. He's showing this cliff. You're not sure what's man-made and what's natural. You're not sure what's his and what is a plant that's growing there. You're not sure what's seaweed and what's tangle. You climb up it. At the very top, you get these strange gods up at the top. Now, you know, Barcelona means fundamentally the city of the Barcas. And the Barcas are the great Carthaginian family. Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal Barca. These are the people that made Rome tremble. And they were Punic. They were Phoenician, basically. And their major god was Moloch. And we know now from excavations in Carthage that what the Romans said about them was true. They did sacrifice infants. And they sacrificed them by, Moloch was a great hollow god, burning with a fire inside. He was a furnace. And they would throw the babies into the furnace. The requiem for the innocents, anyway. And almost as that's what you've got up there, because those are all hollow. And they're expressed as stressed skin. You can see how the bending of it gives it its structural tension up there. And they're housing stairway heads and fireplace chimneys and vents, all kinds of things. And everything is used to get this great effect, one like a great god, hollow, like a great furnace. And then in front of it, priests or guards in hollow helmets. Hollow helmets. Nothing like that for an image. I don't know if you ever saw Alexander Nevsky, that great thing by Eisenstein, where the Teutonic Knights are charging across the ice against the Russian masses waiting for them here, and they're hollow-eyed. Great things like this, and the music is going bum, 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 la, 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 la. It's like this. Or Tolkien, you know, he exploits that in the Nazgul, the hollow men, the hollow king, the hollow, there's nothing inside it. Really wonderful. And they're all vents and stair headings and so on. And they burn in masses like this. And then he also evokes the mountains out there in the distance. The Parque Güell and the mountains behind it, as you have it like this. Now, as I said, when we started teaching with the miserable background we'd had in the history of modernism, we really never heard of Gaudi, but that wasn't the case at all. Gaudi is the father of Expressionism, especially of German Expressionism, answering the need of Germany, the anguish of Germany after World War I. And it sort of goes like this. Here you have Gaudi, and we have this continuity that looks like concrete, but really is stone cut. Then you get that continuity again that looks like concrete, only it's actually really brick and rubble stuccoed over. And it's clearly like a Gaudi, it's representational, making you think of cliffs. There, though the representation is of something mechanical. And it's the famous so-called Einstein Tower in Potsdam, which is an observatory by Erich Mendelsohn. And it's right after the war, 1920-21. You see what it looks like. It's as if you have the sea. It really is a U-boat. You really feel it. You really feel it going on the surface like this, the water coming down behind it like this. And everything makes you feel that direction. But as an observatory, it's wonderful. It's coming up out of the earth, going up there to look at the stars. Really a wonderful thing. And that's right out of Gaudi. Or again, that diagonal structure, deriving from his own wonderful misreading, as Bloom would call it, of a Gothic revival structure, as we saw, with the diagonals. Well, that, remember, Maybeck did it too in the Phoebe Hearst Memorial here. But then it also inspires one of the really great buildings of the period just before the war. One which you find so seldom in histories of architecture. It's the great Jahrhundertshall, the 100-year hall, the Centennial Hall in Breslau of 1913, to commemorate the great victory of Leipzig by the Germans over Napoleon in 1813. And it's by a man named Max Berg. It's a great meeting hall. Now look what it is, a mass program for the New Age. Look at the size of those concrete members. These are concrete, reinforced concrete, with the continuity running down through the reinforcing all through it here. Now, you see what it is? It's all continuity. It's all flow. It's all that diagonal that comes down and is brought down in continuous profiles to the ground. And again, it's like if you took something medieval or late Roman, like Hagia Sophia. You see, it's as if you started here, you started with this, and you took all this out. And instead of having the structure of this disappear, which is what they wanted to do here, to make it look as if it flowed, he takes it, instead of being a circle, a square, which changes to a circle up here, it starts as a circle and goes up continuously. This. So what you get in this photograph, you see the whole thing, it's this great circular space with the diagonals coming down and the light coming in strange places. And a mass program, a modern mass program for the cannon fodder of World War I, designed in 1913. Then after the war, you see, the Germans look at all this, they look at the horror around them, and they have these visions. One of them is of a star church. It's by a man named Otto Bartning. It was never built, 1924. But look how he's exploiting the same things. The continuity, see these arches, each of these arches goes up and goes across, goes down. There's no discontinuity between load and support. And the light comes in unexpected places, and you get jagged lighting here, and you feel the agony. It's an agonized interior that you have there. It's thus expressionist. And if you look at it in profile, you see what he's doing. It goes up like this, goes across. Now that's exactly the way, so he uses another method, but that's exactly the effect that Jörn Utzon, if I pronounce it correctly, got in the Sydney Opera House, which was picked out of a pile of rejects by Eero Saarinen in the competition of the early 1950s. And after agonized attempts to build it, changing it over and over again with many different architects, it finally is really one of the great monuments, I suppose, of the world here. You come into Sydney, everything about sailing, everything about the sea, everything about the great Pacific is really all there, that wonderful thing by the harbor. So it really goes back to this. Or again, go back to Gaudi. Here's one of the interiors of that house I showed you that had the masks and the lizard top. Look when you go up the stairs. Where are you? Like this. Now that is picked up, all that, where architecture is fluid with your emotions. It's picked up by a great director named Robert Wiener in Germany, right after the war, which sums up the whole German mood. That is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Maybe the most important movie ever made, in this sense. And remember the great Conrad Veidt. You remember him later, he used to play Nazi generals. He played in Casablanca. He was the bad. Now here he's playing this strange creature who works for this mad doctor who sends him out to abduct virgins and carry them through the streets. Somebody wrote that he slips like slime through the streets of the town. And the architecture is all adjusted to that mood, you see. like this, going here, and it's all Gaudi. Look, Gaudi has it already. He looked at Gaudi, you know that. Or here's where a stair is turning. How mad that is. Now that also makes you feel of the climactic scene in the movie, which is the great prophetic scene where the hero, that poor fellow here, pursues the mad doctor all through town, and he finds him in the asylum. And he sees the doctor go in the asylum. He says, he's a patient. He gets in there and he finds that he's not a patient, he's the director. He runs the place. Hitler, they all say later, 10 years later, everybody says, that's Hitler. There he is. And when the guy realizes it, he screams and runs, you see? And the architecture goes crazy, all around him like that. Look, it's all here. It's all in Gaudi. Here's that Familia Guel, that chapel I showed you before. Look at it. This whole architecture. Look at those little windows like crazy birds screaming. And he's got on and on. This is expressionist architecture. This is what poor Philip Johnson was trying to do in the last years of his life. Any event. And that's it there. Or again, so you get these wonderful drawings by Wiener for these sets. And that's almost a perfect one of the German condition in 1919. Just bowed down, crazy window, in a cell, in a dungeon. Light coming down like this. Both sides. It's there. And it's also there in Bartning. Same images of sorrow, giving all that wonderful expressionist architecture in Germany of the 20s. But also, and here's the amazing thing, this thing which seems so individual, so Freudian, having to do with the individual psyche, all that, is one of the basic inspirations for the most important and best worked out public housing, large-scale, low-cost public housing that the 20th century produced. And it all starts in Amsterdam, here, with Michael de Klerk on the right. That's what I'm going to talk about next time. Thank you. Have a good vacation.